In this case, we'll look at how Dwight David Eisenhower handled African American civil rights from the Brown case through 1960. Eisenhower had been Supreme Commander of the Allied troops in Europe and knew the contributions of African Americans. He wasn't a racist. At the same time, however, Eisenhower didn't want the controversial civil rights issue to upset his economic and foreign policy agenda. Eisenhower wanted to remain popular and recognized that the Brown decision had launched massive resistance against desegregation. He didn't want violence to tar his legacy. Privately, he termed his appointment of Chief Justice Earl Warren, the architect of the Brown decision, quote, the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made, unquote. Publicly, he never endorsed the Brown decision and said simply, quote, I don't believe you can change the hearts of men with laws or decisions, unquote. Southern resistance to school desegregation kind of reached a climax in September 1957. Although a Little Rock School Board had accepted a federal court order to desegregate Central High School there, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus mobilized the state's National Guard to bar 9 African American students from entering the school. After another court order forced Faubus to withdraw the guardsmen, an angry mob of whites blocked the students' entry. Now, Eisenhower sought to avoid the divisive issue of his civil rights, as I say, but he believed he had to uphold the federal order. He worried that the Soviets were going to make hay of this, and the Cold War made segregation in the U.S. kind of like a national security liability. Anyway, what Eisenhower did was he federalized the Arkansas National Guard, and for the first time since Reconstruction, dispatched federal troops to protect blacks' rights. To ensure the safety of the black students, soldiers patrolled Central High School for the rest of the year. Rather than accept integration, however, Faubus shut down Little Rock's public schools for 2 years. At the end of the decade, fewer than 1% of African American students in the Deep South attended desegregated schools. Nevertheless, Little Rock strengthened the determination of African Americans to end Jim Crow. And, it foreshadowed a lot of the forces that would play out later in the Civil Rights Movement. As Eisenhower feared, the Brown case had indeed encouraged additional nonviolent civil protest. The Brown case and the numerous cases that followed set the precedent that desegregated public tax-supported entities, but it did nothing for privately owned facilities that served the public. Privately owned facilities and businesses could still segregate blacks or deny black services, businesses such as restaurants, hotels, or busing companies. So on the heels of the Brown case, black activists began planning protests against such segregation in private businesses that served the public. Now, in much of the South, black bus riders had to surrender their seats so that no white rider could stand. Although they were 3/4 of all passengers, the African Americans had to pay their fares at the front of the bus, but often leave and re-enter from the rear door. They would often have to sit in the last rows. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, for many years an officer in Montgomery, Alabama's NAACP and a veteran of the civil rights protest of the 30s and 40s, refused to get up so that a white man could sit. I wasn't tired physically, she later wrote. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. Her arrest sparked Joanne Robinson of the Women's Political Council and other blacks who had been engaged in the freedom struggle in Montgomery to propose a boycott of the buses, the beginning of a mass phase of the civil rights movement. To organize their boycott of the private Montgomery bus company, the activist blacks founded the Montgomery Improvement Association and elected the newly arrived minister Martin Luther King Jr. its leader. Organizing the boycott wasn't an easy task. Blacks still had to get to work, but usually lacked cars. King helped organize and coordinate carpools and kept enthusiasm up as the boycott went on for over a year, often against harassment and violence. In time, the lack of businesses hurt not only the bus company, but the white-owned businesses downtown. King and his allies also sued during the boycott. By the end of 1956, enthusiasm for the boycott among many white Montgomery businesses was weakening, and the Supreme Court finally ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. The nonviolent civil rights movement had another victory, the first against segregation in private facilities that served the public, and their success encouraged further activism. Of course, Martin Luther King was a great choice of a leader. He was a great public speaker and a strategician, and he was committed to the nonviolence, and thereby he realized it would maintain the high moral ground, especially with television. He did plagiarize a portion of his doctoral dissertation, and he was unfaithful to his wife, Greta Scott King. As Americans, we have a tendency to regard our historical heroes as flawless. In regarding them as such, they can lose their humanity. Like everyone, King was human and made his mistakes, but this is not to deny his historical importance and the tremendous legacy he had leading the SCLC and the Montgomery bus boycott. In Congress, liberals pushed for new civil rights protections for African Americans trying to vote. Elections were run by state officials who still employed questionable voting requirements to deny blacks the vote. They'd require literacy tests or poll taxes, among others. To overcome a Southern filibuster led by Strom Thurmond, proponents of a new law had to water down its provisions. The result, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, established a 6-member Civil Rights Commission to gather information and document cases of state officials denying black suffrage rights. It created a Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department with the ability to institute actions against state voting officials. Now, at the same time, however, the law still allowed cases to be in front of juries, which in the South meant that white juries were unlikely to convict. As Eisenhower feared, the civil rights movement was beginning to get really, really ugly. In Mississippi in 1955, a 14-year-old African-American boy was lynched by a white mob when he whistled at a white woman. He was beaten so severely that his mother insisted on an open casket to see what they'd done to his son. The African American nonviolent civil rights activists also began to adopt a new tactic, the sit-ins. The sit-ins actually had been first employed by the Congress of Racial Equality almost 20 years before, but it hadn't gotten much publicity. It got a lot more publicity when African American students at North Carolina A&T State College staged a sit-in at a Woolworth's department store in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina, on February 1st, 1960. They picked Woolworths because it was a national chain and it was susceptible to media pressure. Blacks were not allowed to sit down in certain seats at the lunch counter, and so that's where they sat. And the police were called, and they met some violence, and of course they reacted nonviolently. Well, this soon spread. The sit-in movement soon spread to throughout the South, and by April 1960, 54 cities in 9 southern states had witnessed sit-ins. In April 1960, about 200 veterans of the sit-in movement gathered at a conference sponsored by the SCLC organizer Ella Baker and supported by Martin Luther King Jr. Baker urged the young black college students to organize for a longer struggle beyond the sit-in movement. The group formed a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, known as SNCC, in Atlanta that May. There they elected a young leader from Nashville, Marion Barry, their first chairman. Barry later became a controversial mayor of Washington, D.C., ultimately convicted of drug use and sent to jail. As the nonviolent modern civil rights movement grew and new organizations formed, it's important to remember that not all African Americans shared its goals or strategies. The African American community, after all, has never been a monolith. In the early 1900s, for example, the activist Marcus Garvey sought to repatriate American blacks back to Africa, a goal most American blacks didn't share. In the 1950s, another group of African American activists did not seek integration at all. They were the Nation of Islam, first formed in 1930s, and they believed that African Americans could never gain equality with whites in America, and they supported a separate black nation in America, the so-called Nation of Islam. The movement believed that the Muslim faith was an African religion and Christianity the religion of the slave owners and modern segregationists. The movement didn't advocate armed rebellion, but suggested African Americans defend themselves against violence with equivalent measures. Founded in Detroit, the Nation of Islam had been led for over 20 years by Elijah Muhammad, who always remained a controversial figure. Under his leadership, the Nation of Islam taught that whites were inherently evil. Among other measures, they used alcohol and drugs to keep the African American community down. As such, the Nation of Islam taught blacks to lead a strong, focused, and sober life. It remained attractive because of the anger in the African American community. As Eisenhower prepared to leave office in 1960, the civil rights movement continued to grow, and its liberal supporters in Congress were able to pass another civil rights bill. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 extended the Civil Rights Commission first established 3 years earlier with the Civil Rights Act of '57. Due to the weaknesses of the earlier act, the new legislation empowered the federal courts to appoint referees to consider whether any given state's voter registration requirements were discriminatory. The referee appointed when any African American claimed a state requirement hindered his voting. The new law also strengthened federal penalties against private citizens who on their own tried to keep anyone from voting. This concludes the section on Dwight Eisenhower's record on African American civil rights.